In Luke 14, people are coming to Jesus. Great crowds are coming to Jesus. And one would think these great crowds would cause Jesus to soften his message, but they don't. Instead, what we see in the gospel, when Jesus has great crowds, that's when he often preaches some of his most convicting messages. You see, Jesus isn't concerned with the size of the crowd. He cares about the commitment of the crowd. So today we're going to look at three statements here in Luke 14. Three statements that Jesus makes that challenge the crowd, that challenge us to answer the question: am I really following Jesus? Or am I just a fan? And some of us may be sitting here thinking, of course I'm following Jesus. I was baptized. I'm a Christian. I'm sitting in a church pew on Father's Day. There are 1,000 other places I could be this morning. Of course I'm following Jesus. But is it possible that we've settled for some sort of casual Christianity? A form of Christianity that Jesus didn't have in mind, a form of Christianity that really kind of cheapens the gospel of Christ. Is it possible that we've settled for a form of Christianity that doesn't cost us anything? And that's what makes Luke 14 so important for all of us. Because Jesus is pretty clear here in the text that if we want to follow Christ, we have to count the cost. Let's go ahead and read Luke 14, verse 25 through 27 to kick off our study together this morning. Now great crowds were traveling with him, and so he, that's Jesus, turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. What Jesus is telling us here in Luke 14 is hard. It's challenging because what Jesus is asking from us is total commitment. What Jesus is trying to tell us here in the text is that we have to be willing to put him above our family. We have to be willing to put Jesus above ourselves. We have to put Jesus above all of our possessions, and that's just really, really difficult for us. And so that's why here in the text, as we'll find out today, Jesus turns to the crowd and he challenges them to count the cost if they want to follow him. And that invitation to follow Jesus, as we'll find out, is both a gift and a demand. It's a gift because it's something we don't deserve, but it's also a demand because, as we've seen already, it's very, very challenging. And that's what separates those fans from followers. Because fans are fine with giving Jesus a little something, something. Fans like Jesus, but they don't like him too much. But followers count the cost. Followers pay the price. And what we see there in the text, that first challenging statement that Jesus makes to us is about the relational cost of following Jesus. We see that there in verse 26. You know, one of the things that jumps out to me there in verse 26 is 25 and 26 is that when Jesus looks there in the text to the people, he says, if anyone. When Jesus makes these statements, he's not talking to his 12 disciples. He's not talking to religious leaders. He's looking at everyone and tells everyone that if you want to follow me, these things have to be true of you. What Jesus says there in the text would have come as a huge shock to all of them, because family was a big deal to them. Family is still a big deal to us. Today is Father's Day, a day that we traditionally set aside in our country to give our fathers Home Depot gift cards and ties and socks and all sorts of random things that fathers like and fathers may or may not like, to be honest. This is a day that we use to celebrate our fathers. And just a month ago, we celebrated our mothers. Family is still a big deal to us. Don't believe me? Call your parents today and say you're not coming home for Christmas or Thanksgiving and see how well that goes over for you. And don't blame me when you get a harsh response. Family is still a big deal for us. And yet Jesus tells us here in the text in verse 26, if you want to follow me, if you want to be my disciple, Jesus says you got to count the cost. You got to hate your family. Fans don't want to do that. Fans don't want to follow Jesus if it means disappointing their family. Fans don't want to follow Jesus if it hurts their relationship with their friends. Fans don't want to follow Jesus if it interferes with their life. Fans say, Jesus, I like you, but that's a bit too much. So why in the world, at the middle of his ministry here in the Gospel of Luke, would Jesus say this? After all, aren't we supposed to honor our father and mother? Aren't we supposed to love our families? Why in the world does Jesus say this here in the text? What's going on? Help us out here. I think what Jesus is trying to teach us here in Luke 14 is that our love for him must be so great, it must be so all-encompassing that everything else in our life seems dull. Jesus must be first in our heart and first in our life. So much so that when we compare our relationship with Christ with every other relationship we have on earth, there should be no comparison. Jesus must come first. We must hate our family, we must hate our own lives because we love Jesus so much. You know, fans will try to serve Jesus in family. Fans will try to serve Jesus in friends, but Jesus here in the text says, you got to put me first. You have to choose. What will you choose? How will you count the cost? Jesus is very clear here in verse 26 that this is the cost of being a follower of Christ. Do we actually believe this? When we look at Jesus' rather harsh, rather challenging words here in verse 26, do we really believe what Jesus is saying? Because Jesus is making it clear to us even now that he will not share our heart or our affections with anyone or anything else. Jesus wants our whole heart. This is one of those areas I think it's so easy for us to miss the mark. It's so easy for us to put our family first. It's so easy for us to put our spouse or our kids or our family above Christ. Maybe we'll go and we'll spend a truckload of money going to ball games and band concerts. We'll spend a truckload of money on private lessons in sports and music. And by the way, you guys know my wife teaches piano, so it's not like I'm against private lessons. But we'll spend all this money on these activities. We'll spend our time and our energy on our family. But come Sunday morning, we're so tired, we're so exhausted. We're too tired to gather with our church family. We're too tired to gather and worship God. And what we're doing in those moments is we're showing our family, we're showing our friends that really we value them more than we value God. And that's why I think Jesus is honest with the crowd and he's honest with us. He lets us know up front what it will cost. That if they decide to follow Jesus, it's going to affect their relationship with their spouse. Some of you may have experienced that yourself. If you're going to follow Jesus, it's going to affect your relationship with your parents. That's something maybe you've experienced in your life. If you're going to follow Jesus, that's going to affect your relationship with your kids and your friends. Is that a price we are willing to pay? If our spouse was to call us into the kitchen even today and say, look, you got to make a choice. I don't mind you going to church. Jesus is good for you, but you got to make a decision here. It's either Jesus or me. What would we choose in that moment? If following Jesus meant being cut off from our family and our friends, would we still follow Jesus? Followers count the cost. They pay the price, even if it affects their relationships with their family and their friends. That second challenging statement that we see here in the text has to do with the sacrificial cost of following Jesus. I think it's interesting, of all the things that Jesus could have said to the crowd here in this moment, in this day and time, he could have said, take up my traditions and follow after me. Take up my teaching and follow after me. Take up my religious activities and follow after me. But instead, there in verse 27, he says, you have to bear your own cross and follow after me. What Jesus says there in the text would have horrified the Jews, because the cross was not a religious symbol 2,000 years ago. The cross was a cruel and horrible way to die. It wasn't something you decorated your house with. It wasn't something you cross-stitched on pillows. It was a cruel and unusual form of torture and punishment. And Jesus is making it clear here in the text that if you want to follow after him, that if you want to be his disciple, you have to bear your cross. You see, Jesus isn't looking for fans in the stands. He's looking for followers who are willing to bear their own crosses and follow after him. Jesus is telling us that following Jesus means dying to self, that we must be willing to bury all of our hopes, all of our dreams, all of our aspirations, all of our goals, everything. We must be able to sacrifice everything to follow close to him. I think about what Paul says there in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. You may remember the song that we sometimes sing, or maybe kids sing at camp. I have been crucified with Christ. It's not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. What Paul realizes, and he teaches us there in Galatians chapter 2:20, is that if we're not willing to bear our cross, if we're not willing to crucify ourselves, we cannot be his disciple. So what is Jesus trying to teach us here in the text? I think he's trying to teach us that discipleship requires sacrifice. There are no exceptions. Remember, Jesus isn't talking to the disciples. He's not talking to religious leaders. He's talking to the crowd. He's talking to us. And tells us that if we're not willing to bear our cross, we cannot be his disciple. And this is where I think we struggle. You see, fans are willing to give Jesus a little bit of time on Sunday. They're willing to give God a little bit of time on Wednesday. They're willing to darken the door every time the doors are open. But that's not bearing a cross. That's checking a time clock. That's casual Christianity. Christianity without commitment. Jesus demands more. Jesus demands sacrifice. When we think about casual Christianity, the idea that comes to my mind, at least, is those days before you're dating when you're keeping things casual. You may go out for ice cream. You may go out for coffee. You're keeping it casual. There's no commitment at all. You may go out with somebody else the next night. They may go out with somebody else the next night. You're keeping it casual. There's no commitment. And that's sometimes what we do with Jesus. We like Jesus, but we aren't ready to commit to him. We like Jesus, but we don't want to sacrifice for him. Casual Christians want enough Jesus to save him, but not enough Jesus to change them. But Jesus says here in the text that we cannot follow him unless we're willing to sacrifice everything to be his disciple. We must be able to put our own lives on the line to follow him. The third challenging statement that Jesus makes here in the text is about the financial cost of following him. There in verse 28, he doesn't back down. He tells us the price up front. And now Jesus goes on to tell us to count the cost. And to drive this point home, he tells two parables, two very similar parables. The first one is about building a tower. And it says, look, if you're going to build a tower, don't you count the cost of how much it's going to cost you? There have been a couple houses, maybe you've seen them on social media or around the internet somewhere. I think a couple are actually here in Texas. Really these massive mansions where they got like halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, and they ran out of money. And for 20 years, these massive mega mansions have sat empty because the builder didn't count the cost. And it served as an embarrassment to the builder. They didn't see how much it was going to cost them. But that second parable he tells them there in verse 31 is about a king getting ready to go to war. And he makes sure that before he goes to war in verse 31, he's got to make sure that he has enough with his 10,000 men to defeat the one who comes with him at 20,000. And if he doesn't have enough men to win the battle, he's going to try to make peace because he knows he'll lose. You've got to count the cost of following Jesus. And one thing that strikes me about both of those parables is that both of those parables require careful and calculated thought. You know, as I think about my life and your life and our lives today, it seems like everything we do, every decision we make involves counting the cost. But if I want to learn to play guitar, which I've tried to do in the past, I have to be willing to spend the time and the energy and potentially the money to get private lessons to learn how to play guitar. And if I'm not willing to spend the time and the money and the energy to learn how to play guitar, then I'm never going to learn how to play guitar. And if I'm hungry and I want some Chick-fil-A, I have to be willing to count the cost. I have to be willing to pay the $10 for a Chick-fil-A combo. And if I'm not willing to pay the $10 for a Chick-fil-A combo, I'm not going to get a Chick-fil-A combo. Same thing goes for following Christ. If we want to be a disciple of Christ, we need to count the cost. And here's the thing, I wonder if we've watered down the gospel message. That we've watered down the gospel message to 5 things. Hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, and that's it, you're good to go. That's 5 steps. Yes, but that's not commitment. That's not counting the cost. You see, following Christ is more than getting wet in the waters of baptism. Fans get wet. Followers count the cost. Followers are willing to give up everything, their home, their money, their jobs, their cars. They're willing to give up everything to follow Christ. And so there, after teaching these 2 parables, Jesus concludes there in verse 33, in the same way, therefore, each one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. Jesus knows we can't serve God in money. He says you got to count the cost. You have to choose. I think that's what at the heart of Matthew 6 and verse 24. We looked at it in our Bible classes just a few weeks ago, where Jesus says there in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount that no one can serve 2 masters, since he will either hate one or love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You know, it's easy for us even today as Americans to think that we can serve God in money. We're fabulously wealthy here in this country. But Jesus knows better. Jesus knows we can't bow down to the idol of money and wealth. So he says, count the costs. You got to be willing to pay the price. And if you're not willing to count the costs, you cannot be his disciple. And there's a reason for that. Jesus knows there in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 21 that where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. In other words, Jesus knows where we spend our time, our money, our energy, our focus, reveals the true desire of our heart. And I think that may be one reason Jesus spends so much time talking about money. He spends more time talking about money, I think, in the Sermon on the Mount than he does anything else. Because Jesus realizes money and what money can buy can take our heart away from him. And this should be a huge wake-up call for all of us. Because fans like Jesus, as long as he doesn't interfere with their comfort. Fans like Jesus, as long as he doesn't interfere with their life. Fans like Jesus, as long as it costs them anything. But followers say, I'll give it all up to follow after him. I think about the disciples. A couple of the disciples left thriving businesses. Matthew, or Levi, was a tax collector. He was wealthy. And yet he left that behind to follow after Jesus. A couple of the apostles, a couple of the disciples were fishermen, and they had a thriving fishing business, and yet they left it behind to follow after Jesus. They counted the cost, and it was worth it to them. Have we counted the cost? If following Jesus meant losing everything, would it still be worth it? You know, I think about what the Hebrew writer says there in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 32. As he's writing to these Christians, these early Christians who are suffering, they're wondering, should they keep following Jesus? Is it worth it? Is it really, really worth it? And he looks back there in verse 32 and says, remember the earlier days when, after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to taunts and afflictions. And other times you were companions of those who were treated that way. For you sympathized with prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation of your possessions, because you know that you yourselves have a better and enduring possession. They accepted with joy the confiscation of their possessions. How in the world do you rejoice when all your stuff is being packed up in a U-Haul and taken away from you? They could rejoice because they knew they had a better and enduring possession. They could rejoice because their focus was on following Christ, not the possessions of this world. Is that something we're willing to do? Is that the attitude we have? If we were to lose every possession today, could we rejoice? You know, for the longest time here in this country, following Christ has been relatively easy. Following Christ helped you get elected to political office. Following Christ may help you in the business world meet new clients and maybe even get a promotion because you could put, hey, I go to this church, and that looks good on your resume. But not anymore. Things seem to be changing. And there may come a time that here, and even in our country, that we're going to have to choose between our possessions and following Christ. In that day, if that day comes, what will we choose? You see, followers count the cost. Followers make the sacrifice. Followers give up everything because they know following Christ is worth it. So it's important for us to take a moment, even for us today, to count the cost. Not just the cost of following Jesus, but the cost of not following Jesus. Because a day is coming. A day is coming when Jesus will return. And on that day, when Jesus returns and he's judging the whole world, what will he say to us? That on that day, it's possible for us to gain the whole world and yet lose our soul. Or on that day, will we lose the whole world but gain our soul? Have we counted the cost? Maybe you've counted the cost and you're ready to start following Jesus. Our God is alive. Our God does redeem. Our God does rescue. Our God still forgives. And he still invites you to follow him